Before dawn, the baker opened her shop, the smell of fresh bread filling the empty streets. One morning, a poor cowboy stumbled in, hungry, tired, and penniless. Without hesitation, she handed him a loaf and a smile, asking for nothing in return. Months later, carriages rolled into town, and that same cowboy stepped out, no longer poor, but powerful. The woman who once fed him out of kindness was now working in the bakery he owned. The storm came in fast, the kind that swallowed the prairie whole and turned the sky black hours before sunset. Eleanor Brooks stood at the window of her bakery, watching the wind bend the cottonwoods double, watching dust and tumbleweeds scrape past like ghosts fleeing judgment. Thunder rolled somewhere beyond the hills, low and patient, promising worse to come. She should have closed up an hour ago, should have locked the door, shuttered the windows, gone upstairs to the cramped room above the shop where her husband's clothes still hung in the closet, where silence lived like a permanent guest. But the morning's bread sat unsold on the cooling racks, and desperation had a way of keeping the lamp burning long after sense said to let it die. The wind screamed. Rain began to hammer the glass in sheets, and Eleanor turned from the window, wrapping her shawl tighter around her shoulders. The stove glowed red in the corner, the only warmth left in a world gone cold. She moved toward it, thinking of bed, of sleep, of tomorrow's flour, and whether she'd have enough to make it through the week. That's when she heard it. A sound beneath the wind, a thud against the door, heavy and wrong. She froze, hands still clutching the shawl, heart suddenly loud in her chest. For a moment she thought it was just the storm, a branch maybe, or debris flung against the wood. But then it came again, a thump, deliberate, human. Eleanor's breath caught, her eyes went to the door, then to the knife on the counter, then back to the door. Out here, miles from anything resembling law, a knock after dark could mean trouble. Could mean men with guns and empty morals, the kind who took what they wanted and left only ash and grief behind. The wind howled, rain pounded, and the door shook again, weaker this time, like whoever was out there was losing strength. She shouldn't open it. Every instinct screamed against it. But something else stirred beneath the fear, something her mother had planted in her long ago, something about mercy and what it cost to turn away from suffering. Eleanor crossed the room in 3 quick steps, her hand trembling as it reached for the latch. She hesitated, just for a breath, then pulled the door open. The man collapsed inward like a bag of stones. He hit the floor hard, mud and rainwater spreading beneath him in a dark pool. Eleanor stumbled back, gasping, her hand flying to her mouth. He was big, broad-shouldered, dressed in a torn shirt and trousers caked with mud and something darker. Blood. His hat had fallen off somewhere, and his dark hair was plastered to his head, rain still dripping from his jaw. The wind shrieked through the open door, pulling at her skirt, sending flour dust swirling into the air. Eleanor stared down at him, frozen between fear and something sharper. He didn't move, didn't speak, just lay there, chest rising and falling in shallow, ragged breaths. She should shut the door, should drag him back outside and bolt the lock and pretend she'd never seen him. But his hand twitched, fingers curling against the floorboards, and she saw the gash along his ribs, deep, ugly, bleeding through his shirt. "Damn it," she whispered, and the curse felt like prayer. Eleanor slammed the door shut against the storm and dropped to her knees beside him. Up close, she could see more. The bruises along his jaw, the swelling around his left eye, the way his breathing hitched like every inhale cost him. He'd been beaten. Or worse. "Can you hear me?" Her voice came out steadier than she felt. No answer. His eyes stayed closed, lashes dark against pale skin. She pressed 2 fingers to his neck, felt the pulse there. Weak, but present. Alive. Barely. She couldn't lift him. Not alone. But she could drag him, inch by agonizing inch, away from the door and toward the stove. Her hands slipped on his wet shirt, her back screaming in protest. But she didn't stop. Couldn't. By the time she got him near the warmth, her arms were shaking and her breath came in gasps. Eleanor stood, staring down at him, at the stranger bleeding on her floor. Then she moved. She grabbed every clean rag she had, tore her good apron into strips, filled a basin with water from the pump. Her hands worked without thinking, falling into the rhythm of care she'd learned tending her husband through his last fever, the one that had taken him 2 winters ago and left her alone in a town that didn't forgive widows for staying alive. She peeled the man's shirt back, hissing at the sight of the wound. Not a bullet, thank God, something sharp. A knife, maybe, or barbed wire. The edges were ragged, still seeping. She cleaned it as best she could, pressed cloth against it until the bleeding slowed, then bound it tight with the apron strips. Her fingers moved with a steadiness that belied the hammering of her heart. The fire crackled. Outside, the storm raged. Inside, there was only the sound of water dripping onto floorboards and the stranger's labored breathing. Eleanor sat back on her heels, exhausted, and let herself look at him. Really look. His face was weathered, lined in ways that spoke of sun and wind and years spent outdoors. A cowboy, maybe. Or a drifter. His hands were calloused, scarred, the kind of hands that knew hard work. But there was something else, something in the way his jaw was set, even unconscious, that spoke of stubbornness. Of survival. Who was he? What had happened to him? And why had he come here, to her door, in the middle of a storm that could kill a man twice as strong? She didn't have answers, only questions that circled like vultures. Eleanor pulled a blanket from the cupboard and draped it over him, tucking it around his shoulders. Then she sat down on the floor beside him, back against the wall, and watched the rise and fall of his chest. The stove's warmth pressed against her side. The storm began to quiet, its fury spent, leaving only the steady patter of rain against glass. She should be afraid, should be wondering if he'd wake up violent, if he'd brought danger to her doorstep, but all she felt was tired. Tired, and something else, something that felt almost like relief. For the first time in months, the bakery wasn't empty. For the first time since James died, she wasn't alone. The man's breathing evened out. His face relaxed, pain giving way to something closer to sleep. Eleanor closed her eyes, just for a moment, and let the exhaustion pull her under. When she woke, dawn light was spilling through the window in pale gold streaks. The storm had passed, leaving the world scrubbed clean and dripping. Birds sang somewhere beyond the glass. The stove had gone cold, and the stranger was gone. Eleanor sat up, heart lurching, eyes scanning the room. The blanket lay crumpled on the floor. The bloodied rags were still there, proof she hadn't dreamed it. But the man, he'd vanished, like smoke. She scrambled to her feet, wincing at the stiffness in her back, and crossed to the door. It was unlatched, hanging slightly ajar. She pushed it open and stepped outside, barefoot onto wet boards, squinting against the morning light. The street was empty. Puddles reflected the sky. Somewhere down the way, a rooster crowed. No sign of him. No tracks, no blood trail, nothing. Eleanor stood there, shivering in the cold, wondering if she'd made a mistake, if Mercy had just invited something dark into her life. Then she turned back inside, ready to salvage what she could of the morning, and froze. On the counter, beside the flour sack and the old tin register, sat a single silver coin. It gleamed in the light, clean and bright, worth more than any loaf she'd baked in weeks. She picked it up, turning it over in her palm, feeling its weight. No note, no explanation. Just this, a token left behind by a man who'd bled on her floor and disappeared before she could ask his name. Eleanor closed her fingers around the coin, her throat tight, and stared out the window at the empty street. The storm had passed, but something told her the silence that followed was just the breath before the next one began. The town woke slow, like it always did after a storm. Water dripped from eaves and pooled in the wagon ruts carved deep into Main Street. The air smelled clean, electric, the way it only did after thunder had scrubbed the sky raw. Eleanor opened the bakery at dawn, same as every morning, and set about the work of surviving. Flour, water, salt, yeast. Her hands moved through the rhythm without thought, kneading dough that would feed people who barely looked at her anymore. The coin sat in her apron pocket, cold and strange, a reminder of something she couldn't quite name. She'd thought about spending it, God knew she needed to, but every time her fingers brushed its surface, she hesitated. It felt like a promise, or a question. The first customers came in as the sun climbed higher. Mrs. Calloway, picking up rolls for her boarding house. Old Mr. Ensign, buying day-old bread because it was cheaper. A handful of ranch hands passing through, their boots leaving mud across the floor Eleanor had just scrubbed. They paid in coins and crumpled bills, their eyes sliding past her like she was part of the furniture. No one mentioned the storm. No one asked if she was all right. By noon, the gossip started. Eleanor heard it through the open window while she worked, voices drifting up from the street, low and sharp. Saw a man near the creek yesterday, just before the rain hit. Drifter, probably. You know the type. Covered in mud, half dead from the look of him. Sheriff ought to know. Could be trouble. Eleanor's hands stilled in the dough. She listened, heart tight, as the voices faded down the street. They hadn't seen him here, hadn't connected him to her bakery. Not yet, but they would, eventually. This town had a way of knowing things, of sniffing out secrets like dogs on a scent. She dusted flour from her hands and went back to work, trying to ignore the knot in her stomach. The afternoon stretched long and quiet. Eleanor sold 3 loaves and a handful of biscuits, barely enough to cover the cost of the flour she'd used. She swept the floor, wiped down the counters, rearranged the shelves, anything to keep her hands busy, to keep her mind from circling back to the man with the dark eyes and the wound in his side. She told herself it didn't matter. He was gone. Whatever had happened, whoever he was, it was over. Then the door opened, and he walked in. Eleanor's breath stopped. He stood in the doorway, hat in hand, his silhouette framed by the afternoon light. Cleaned up, he looked different. Younger, maybe, though the lines around his eyes spoke of years lived hard. His shirt was still torn, but the blood was gone, washed away. The bruises on his face had darkened to purple and yellow, and he moved carefully, like every step cost him. For a moment, they just stared at each other. Then he cleared his throat, his voice rough and low. "Ma'am," Eleanor's hands tightened on the rag she'd been holding. "You're alive." A flicker of something crossed his face. Surprise maybe, or relief. Seemed so. "I didn't think—" She stopped, unsure what to say. "Didn't think you'd come back? Didn't think you'd survive? Didn't think I'd see you again?" He took a step inside, slow, like he was afraid she might bolt. "I wanted to thank you. For last night." Eleanor's jaw tightened. "You left. Had to." His eyes flicked toward the window, then back to her. "Didn't want to bring trouble to your door." "Little late for that," she said, sharper than she meant. But the fear from last night was still there, coiled tight in her chest, and it came out as anger. He nodded, accepting it. "I know." Silence hung between them, heavy and uncertain. Outside, a wagon rattled past. The afternoon sun slanted through the window, casting long shadows across the floor. "I left payment," he said finally, gesturing toward the counter. "For the trouble. I found it. Good." Another beat of silence. Then Eleanor set the rag down and crossed her arms, studying him. "You have a name? Cal Weston." "Where you from, Cal Weston?" "Nowhere lately." She didn't smile, but something in her chest loosened just a fraction. "You always show up half dead at strangers' doors?" His mouth twitched, almost a smile. "Not if I can help it." Eleanor shook her head, exasperated despite herself. Then she glanced at the wound beneath his shirt, the way he was favoring his left side. "You should sit down before you fall down." "I'm fine. You're bleeding through your bandages." He looked down, surprised, and she saw the dark stain spreading along his ribs. He'd pushed himself too hard, too fast. Stubborn fool. "Sit," she said again, firmer this time, and pointed to the chair by the stove. "Before you ruin my floor twice." This time, he didn't argue. He lowered himself into the chair with a grimace, and Eleanor went to get fresh cloth and water. Her hands moved through the motions automatically, untying the old bandages, cleaning the wound, rebinding it with strips she should have saved for mending her own clothes. He didn't flinch, didn't make a sound, just watched her with those dark, steady eyes. "You do this a lot?" he asked quietly. "Take in strays?" She pulled the knot tight, maybe harder than necessary. "No, you're the first." "Lucky me." She met his gaze, and for a second, something passed between them, understanding maybe, or just recognition of two people too stubborn to quit when quitting made sense. "Why'd you come back?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment, his jaw working. Then, "Coin wasn't enough. Figured I owed you more than silver. You don't owe me anything." "I do." His voice was firm, certain. "Let me work. Pay it off proper." Eleanor straightened, frowning. "Work? Doing what? Whatever you need. I'm decent with my hands when they're not busted." He gestured around the bakery. The sagging shutters, the door that stuck, the roof she knew leaked every time it rained. Place could use some fixing. She wanted to say no, wanted to send him away before anyone saw him here, before the town started talking. But the truth was, he was right. The bakery was falling apart, same as her, and she didn't have the money or the strength to hold it together alone. "1 week," she said finally. "You work off what you owe, then you leave. Understood?" Cal nodded. "Understood, and you stay out of sight. If anyone asks, you're a cousin from back east helping out. I can do that." Eleanor wasn't sure she believed him, but she was too tired to argue. "There's a room out back, used to be storage. You can sleep there. It's not much. It's more than I had yesterday." She handed him a piece of bread from the morning's batch, still soft. He took it, surprise flickering across his face, and ate slowly, like he was afraid it might disappear. Outside, the sun dipped lower, painting the street in shades of amber and rust. The town moved around them, unaware, and for a moment, the bakery felt almost peaceful. But Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that she'd just stepped onto a path she couldn't see the end of. That mercy, once given, had a way of tangling lives together in knots too complicated to undo. Cal finished the bread and looked at her, something grateful and raw in his expression. "Thank you." She nodded, not trusting herself to speak, and turned away to busy herself with the evening's cleanup. Behind her, she heard him stand, heard the creak of the back door as he found his way to the storage room. And when she finally glanced over her shoulder, he was gone again. But this time, she knew he'd still be there come morning. The coin stayed in her pocket, warm now from her body heat, and outside the window, the first stars began to prick holes in the darkening sky. The days that followed settled into a rhythm Eleanor hadn't known she'd been missing. Cal woke before dawn, same as her, and set to work without being asked. He fixed the shutters first, planing down the warped wood until they closed smooth and tight. Then he patched the roof, hauling himself up the ladder with the careful movements of a man whose ribs still screamed with every breath. Eleanor watched from the window, flour dusting her hands, and tried not to think about how strange it was to have someone else in her space again. How strange and how easy. He didn't talk much. That suited her fine. They worked side by side in a comfortable silence broken only by the scrape of her rolling pin, the tap of his hammer, the crackle of the stove. Sometimes he'd pause to watch her shape dough, his expression curious, and she'd catch herself explaining without meaning to. "Bread needs time," she said one morning, pressing her palms into the dough, folding it over itself. "You rush it, it never rises right. You gotta let it rest, let it breathe." Cal nodded, leaning against the doorframe, his shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle and scars. "Like people," she glanced at him, surprised. "What? People need time too, to heal, to become what they're supposed to be." Eleanor didn't know what to say to that, so she just kept kneading, her hands moving through the familiar motions while something unfamiliar stirred in her chest. By the end of the first week, the bakery looked better than it had in years. The door no longer stuck. The windows let in more light. The back room, where Cal slept on a bedroll he'd fashioned from old flour sacks, was clean and organized. He'd even built a shelf for her spare pans, sturdy and level, the kind of craftsmanship that spoke of care. Eleanor knew she should send him away. Their agreement had been 1 week, and the week was up. But when she opened her mouth to say so, the words wouldn't come. Instead, she handed him a loaf of bread, still warm, and said, "You ever work in a kitchen before?" He shook his head. "Ranches, mostly. Cattle drives. Some logging up north. Think you can learn?" His eyes met hers, dark and steady. "I can try." So she taught him. Showed him how to measure flour by feel. How to knead until the dough turned smooth and elastic. How to shape loaves that would rise even and golden. His hands were too rough at first, too forceful, but he learned fast. Patient. Focused. And when he pulled his first successful batch from the oven, the pride on his face was so unguarded it made her throat tighten. "Not bad," she said, inspecting the loaves. "Little lopsided, but not bad. Lopsided's better than burned. That's the spirit." They fell into laughter then, soft and unexpected, and for a moment the weight of everything else, the town, the past, the future, lifted. But the town had eyes. It started with Mrs. Calloway, who lingered a little too long at the counter one morning, her gaze sliding past Eleanor to where Cal worked in the back. "That your cousin?" she asked, voice too casual. Eleanor's heart kicked. "Yes. Helping out for a spell. Funny, don't recall you mentioning family before. Didn't seem relevant." Mrs. Calloway's eyes narrowed, but she took her rolls and left without another word. Eleanor watched her go, dread pooling cold in her stomach. By afternoon, the whispers had started. She heard them through the window, saw them in the way people glanced toward the bakery as they passed. Curious looks, suspicious ones, the kind that meant trouble was brewing, slow and inevitable. Cal noticed too. He was hauling a sack of flour when she caught the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw tightened as a group of men loitered across the street, staring. "Maybe I should move on," he said quietly that evening, after the last customer had gone. Eleanor was wiping down the counter. She didn't look up. "You just getting the hang of bread. Don't want to make things harder for you. Things have been hard since James died. You being here doesn't change that." He was silent for a long moment. "Then why are you letting me stay?" She paused, rag in hand, and finally met his gaze. "Because I don't like being told who I can help. And because you're the first person in 2 years who's looked at me like I'm more than a ghost in an apron." Something shifted in his expression. Surprise, gratitude, something else she couldn't name. "You're not a ghost. Tell that to the town. The town's wrong." Eleanor smiled, bitter and tired. "The town's always wrong. Doesn't stop them from being loud about it." That night, they sat by the stove after the work was done. The kind of quiet that felt less like absence and more like presence. Cal whittled a piece of wood he'd found out back, shaping it into something Eleanor couldn't quite make out yet. She mended a tear in her apron, needle flashing in the firelight. "Where'd you learn that?" she asked, nodding toward the carving. "My father, before he died, I'm sorry, was a long time ago. He turned the wood in his hands, studying it. He used to say a man's worth was in what he could build, not what he could take." "Smart man, yeah." Cal's voice went soft. "He was—" Eleanor tied off the thread and set the apron aside. "You miss him? Every day." She understood that. Miss James every day too, in ways that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with the shape a person leaves behind when they're gone. The empty space that never quite fills. "What about you?" Cal asked. "Your husband, what was he like?" Eleanor was quiet, searching for words. Kind, quiet, worked himself to death trying to keep this place running. She gestured around the bakery. "He believed if you did good work, people would see it, would respect it." "And do they?" She laughed hollow. "No. They see a widow who can't let go. Then they're blind." The certainty in his voice startled her. She looked at him, really looked, and saw the way the firelight caught in his eyes, the way his hands had stilled on the carving. Saw something she hadn't let herself notice before, how he looked at her. Not with pity, not with judgment, just presence. Her breath caught. "Cal." The window shattered. Glass exploded inward, and Eleanor screamed, throwing her arms up as shards rained down around her. Cal was on his feet in an instant, pulling her away from the window, his body between her and the broken glass. Outside she heard laughter, young, cruel, fading fast down the street. "You all right?" His hands were on her shoulders, his voice urgent. She nodded, shaking, and looked past him at the damage. A rock lay in the middle of the floor, wrapped in paper. Cal picked it up, unwrapped it, his face going hard. Eleanor didn't need to ask. She could see the words scrawled across the paper, ugly and deliberate. Criminal. Her hands curled into fists. "They know." Cal's jaw tightened. "I'll leave tonight. No, Eleanor, no." She yanked the paper from his hands, crumpled it, threw it into the stove. The flames devoured it, quick and merciless. "I'm tired of this town deciding who deserves mercy. You stay. They'll make it worse. Let them try." He stared at her, something fierce and grateful burning in his expression. Then he nodded, once, and went to board up the window. Eleanor stood in the wreckage, glass crunching under her boots, and felt something harden in her chest. Not anger, not fear. Something colder, sharper. Resolve. Outside, the night pressed close, and somewhere in the dark, the town waited, watching, judging, ready to strike again. But inside the bakery, the fire kept burning, and Eleanor Brooks was done running from shadows. The sheriff came at noon, when the sun was high and merciless. Eleanor heard the horses first. The deliberate heavy rhythm of hooves on packed dirt, the jingle of spurs and tack. She was pulling bread from the oven, sweat beading on her forehead, when the sound cut through the bakery's warmth like a blade through butter. Her hands froze on the wooden paddle. Cal heard it too. He'd been stacking flour sacks in the corner, shirt damp with honest work, but now he straightened, his whole body going still in that way animals do when they sense a predator nearby. Their eyes met across the room. No words. They both knew. Eleanor set the bread down and wiped her hands on her apron, forcing herself to breathe steady, to move normal. Through the window, she watched them arrive, Sheriff Briggs on his gray gelding, flanked by 2 deputies she recognized from the saloon. Behind them, a small crowd had begun to gather, drawn by the spectacle like moths to flame. The sheriff dismounted slow, theatrical, his boots hitting the ground with a thud that carried. He was a big man, thick through the chest and shoulders, with a face carved from suspicion and self-importance. His badge caught the sunlight as he adjusted his gun belt, and Eleanor felt her stomach twist. She'd known this was coming, had known since the rock came through her window 3 nights ago, since the whispers had turned to murmurs and the murmurs to open accusations. The town had made up its mind, and now it was here to collect. The door opened without a knock. Sheriff Briggs filled the frame, his deputies hanging back like dogs waiting for a command. His eyes swept the bakery, over the clean floors, the repaired shutters, the bread cooling on the racks, before landing on Cal. "Cal Weston," he said, and his voice carried out into the street, loud enough for the crowd to hear. "That you?" Cal didn't move, didn't flinch, just stood there, hands loose at his sides, meeting the sheriff's gaze head-on. "It is." "Thought so." Briggs stepped inside, his hand resting on his pistol in a way that was meant to be casual but wasn't. "You're wanted for questioning. Aiding and abetting an armed robbery up near Silver Creek. Stagecoach. 3 men shot." The words hung in the air like smoke. Eleanor's heart slammed against her ribs. She stepped forward before she could stop herself. "There's been a mistake." "No mistake, ma'am." Briggs didn't even look at her. "Got a witness puts him there. Says he was riding with Jesse Kane's gang." "That's not true," Eleanor said, her voice sharper now, cutting. "He's been here. Working. For how long?" 2 weeks. Robbery was 3 weeks back." The crowd outside pressed closer, faces eager and ugly with the promise of violence justified. Eleanor saw Mrs. Calloway among them, saw old Mr. Henson, saw the ranch hands who'd bought bread from her just yesterday. Saw the way they looked at Cal, not like a man, but like a thing to be dealt with. Cal's jaw tightened, but he didn't speak, didn't defend himself, just stood there, and Eleanor wanted to scream at him to say something, to fight back, but she could see it in his eyes. Resignation. Like he'd been here before, like he'd always known it would end this way. "Sheriff," she tried again, stepping between him and Cal, her hands shaking but her voice steady. "Cal Weston is a good man. He's worked hard, kept to himself, caused no trouble. Whatever you think he did, ain't about what I think, ma'am. It's about the law." Briggs finally looked at her then, and there was something almost pitying in his expression. Almost. "You seem like a decent woman. Don't ruin yourself defending trash." The word hit like a slap. Eleanor's hands curled into fists. "Get out." Briggs raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me? I said get out. You want to arrest him, you bring evidence, bring a warrant, bring something more than gossip and a badge." Her voice rose, carrying through the open door to the crowd beyond. "Otherwise you're trespassing." A murmur rippled through the onlookers. The deputies shifted, uncertain. Briggs's face darkened, his hand tightening on his gun. "You're making a mistake," he said, low and dangerous. "The only mistake here is yours." For a long, breathless moment, no one moved. The air felt charged, electric, like the moment before lightning strikes. Eleanor could hear her own heartbeat, could feel Cal's presence behind her, solid and still. Then Briggs smiled, cold and sharp. "All right. Have it your way." He turned toward the door, then paused, looking back at Cal. "You got till sundown tomorrow to turn yourself in. Otherwise I'll come back with a rope, and it won't matter what she says." He left. The deputies followed. But the crowd stayed, lingering like a bad smell, their faces pressed to the windows, their voices rising in a wave of judgment and speculation. Eleanor slammed the door shut and locked it, her whole body trembling now that the adrenaline was crashing. She leaned against the wood, eyes closed, trying to breathe. "You shouldn't have done that," Cal said quietly. She opened her eyes. He was still standing in the same spot, his expression unreadable. "What was I supposed to do? Let them drag you out like an animal? Would have been easier. For who?" He didn't answer. Just looked at her with something raw and complicated in his eyes, gratitude and guilt and fear all tangled together. Eleanor pushed off the door and crossed to him, stopping just close enough to see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands had curled into fists. "Tell me the truth, all of it." Cal exhaled, long and slow, and for the first time since she'd met him, he looked tired, bone-deep, soul-weary tired. "I knew Jesse Kane. Worked his ranch for a season, couple years back. Good pay, no questions. Didn't know what he was into until it was too late. The robbery, yeah. He rubbed a hand over his face. Jesse asked me to ride with him one night. Said he needed help moving cattle. I went. Didn't find out till we were halfway there it wasn't cattle, it was a stagecoach. Told him I wanted no part of it. He laughed, said I was already part of it just by being there. So you left, not fast enough. By the time I got clear, the job was done. 3 men shot, money gone, and my face seen by a witness who thought I was one of them. His voice cracked just slightly. I've been running ever since. Eleanor absorbed this, turning it over in her mind. You didn't pull a trigger. Doesn't matter. I was there. That makes me guilty in the eyes of the law, but not in mine. He looked at her then, really looked, and she saw the disbelief there. The hope. Why? Because I know you. She said it simply, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. I've watched you work. Watched you fix what's broken. Watched you learn patience with dough that won't cooperate. A man who robs and kills doesn't do that. Doesn't care about doing things right. You don't know what. I've done before I got here. Maybe not, but I know who you are now. That's enough. Silence settled between them, thick and fragile. Outside, the crowd was dispersing, their entertainment over for the moment. But Eleanor knew they'd be back. Tomorrow. The day after. The town had tasted blood, and it wouldn't stop until it fed. I have to leave, Cal said finally. Tonight. Before sundown tomorrow. And go where? They'll hunt you down, hang you from the nearest tree and call it justice. Better than staying and watching them burn your bakery down around you. Eleanor's jaw set. They won't. They will. You saw their faces. They're not interested in truth. They want someone to punish, and I'm convenient. He was right. She hated that he was right. But that didn't change anything. Then we prove them wrong, she said. We find Jesse Kane. We get him to confess. Cal laughed, bitter and hollow. Jesse's halfway to Mexico by now, or dead in a ditch. Either way, we'll never find him. So what? You just give up? Let them hang you for something you didn't do? What choice do I have? Eleanor grabbed his arm, her fingers digging into the fabric of his shirt. The choice to fight. To believe that truth matters, even when the world says it doesn't. He stared at her, and she could see the war playing out behind his eyes. The urge to run, to protect her by leaving, warring with something else. Something that wanted desperately to stay. Why are you doing this? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. You don't owe me anything. Maybe I'm just stubborn. She managed to smile, small and fierce. Or maybe I'm tired of good people being ground down by bad ones. Either way, I'm not letting you hang. Cal's throat worked. He looked like he wanted to argue, to push her away for her own good. But instead, he nodded, just once, and she felt the weight of that choice settle between them like a promise. One day, he said, we have one day to figure this out, then we better not waste it. They spent the rest of the afternoon locked inside, windows shuttered, working by lamplight. Eleanor baked bread because it was all she knew how to do, and Cal paced the small space, thinking, planning, trying to find a thread they could pull that wouldn't unravel everything. As the sun sank lower, painting the street outside in shades of rust and shadow, a rock hit the door. Then another, and another. Voices rose, young and drunk on cruelty. Come out, thief! Gonna hang you high! Widow's whore! Eleanor flinched at that last one, but Cal's expression went flat and cold, his hands tightening until his knuckles went white. Ignore them, Eleanor said, kneading harder than necessary, taking her fear out on the dough. They'll get bored. But they didn't. The taunts continued, growing bolder as the darkness deepened. Someone threw something that hit the boarded window with a crack. Laughter followed, high and vicious. Cal moved toward the door, and Eleanor grabbed his wrist. Don't. They need to be stopped, and you walking out. There will do that. You'll give them exactly what they want. An excuse. He looked down at her hand on his arm, then at her face, and slowly, the tension bled out of him. I hate this. I know. I hate that you're caught in it. I walked into it with my eyes open. Doesn't make it right. Eleanor didn't have an answer for that. So instead, she pulled him away from the door, back toward the stove where the lamplight was warmest, where the bread was rising quiet and patient in its tins. Sit, she said. We'll wait them out. And they did. Sat in the growing dark, listening to the voices outside fade as the night deepened and the cold drove the cowards home. By the time silence returned, It was well past midnight, and the bakery felt like the only warm spot left in a world gone hostile. Eleanor stood and stretched, her back aching. "You should sleep. Tomorrow's going to be—" "I'm not the one who should sleep," Cal interrupted, his gaze steady on hers. "You've been up since before dawn. So have you. I'm used to it." They stared at each other, stubborn and exhausted, until Eleanor finally sighed and sank into the chair by the stove. "Fine. But only for an hour." Cal nodded, and she closed her eyes just for a moment, just to rest them. When she woke, pale light was creeping through the cracks in the shutters, and Cal was gone. Panic seized her, sharp and immediate. She lurched to her feet, heart racing, eyes searching the empty bakery. His bedroll was still in the back room. His jacket hung on the peg by the door. But he wasn't there. Eleanor yanked the door open and stumbled out into the cold morning air, scanning the street with wild eyes, and froze. Cal stood in the middle of the street, hands loose at his sides, facing the direction of the sheriff's office, waiting. The sun was just beginning to rise, painting him in gold and shadow, and for a moment he looked like something out of a story. A man standing alone against the world, ready to face whatever came. Eleanor's breath caught. She started toward him, ready to drag him back inside, to yell at him for being a fool. But then she saw his expression. Not resignation, not defeat. Resolve. He turned at the sound of her footsteps, and his mouth quirked into something that might have been a smile. "Figured I'd meet them on my terms." "Cal, I'm not running anymore, Eleanor, and I'm not letting them come for me in your home." She wanted to argue, wanted to tell him he was an idiot, that this solved nothing, that martyrdom was just another word for giving up. But the words stuck in her throat, because she could see it in his eyes. This mattered. Standing here, facing it head-on, mattered. So instead, she walked up beside him and took his hand. His fingers closed around hers, warm and rough and solid. "You don't have to," he started. "Shut up," she said, gentle but firm. "If you're standing here, so am I." Together, they waited for the sheriff to come. And when the hoofbeats finally echoed down the street, when the crowd began to gather again with their eager, hungry faces, Eleanor held Cal's hand tighter and thought about mercy, about truth, about the price of standing for what was right, even when the world called you wrong. The sun climbed higher, burning away the last of the night's cold, and whatever came next, they would face it side by side. Sheriff Briggs rode in with 4 men this time, and the crowd that followed was twice as large as yesterday. They came like spectators to a hanging, hungry for the kind of justice that required no thought, only fury dressed in righteousness. Eleanor felt Cal's hand tense in hers as the horses drew closer, felt the way his breathing changed. Not fear exactly, but something else. Acceptance. The kind that came from a man who'd already made peace with how his story might end. She wouldn't let it end that way. Briggs dismounted with the same theatrical slowness, his eyes sweeping over them, over Cal standing defiant in the middle of the street, over Eleanor beside him, their hands locked together like a promise neither would break. "Weston," Briggs said, his voice carrying across the morning stillness. "Time's up. You coming peacefully, or do we do this the hard way?" Cal's jaw tightened, but before he could speak, Eleanor stepped forward. "He's not going anywhere," she said, and her voice rang clear and strong despite the fear clawing at her throat. "Not until you prove he did something wrong." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Briggs's expression darkened. "Ma'am, I warned you yesterday, and I'm warning you now, Sheriff. You want to arrest an innocent man, you'll have to go through me first." "That can be arranged," one of the deputies muttered, loud enough to be heard. Laughter followed, ugly and mean. Cal moved then, stepping in front of Eleanor, his body a wall between her and the men with guns. "Leave her out of this. You want someone to drag to your cell? Here I am. But you touch her, and law or no law, you'll answer for it." The threat hung in the air, sharp and real. Briggs's hand drifted toward his pistol, and for a moment the street held its breath, balanced on the edge of violence. Then a voice cut through the tension, thin, reedy, but loud enough to matter. "Hold on now." Eleanor turned. Old Mr. Henson was pushing through the crowd, his cane tapping against the dirt, his weathered face set in stubborn determination. He stopped at the edge of the circle, breathing hard, and pointed his cane at the sheriff. "You got proof this boy did what you say?" Briggs frowned. "Got a witness. A witness who was where? Saw what exactly?" Henson's voice grew stronger. I've been in this town 40 years, Sheriff. Seen a lot of men hanged on witness testimony that turned out to be lies or mistakes. You got more than one man's word? Silence. Briggs shifted his weight, his confidence wavering just slightly. The law says a man's innocent till proven guilty. That's still true, or did it change while I wasn't looking? A few people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. Mrs. Calloway was among them, her face tight with something that might have been shame. Eleanor felt a flicker of hope, fragile and dangerous. Briggs's face went hard. This ain't a debate, old man, step aside. Or what? You'll arrest me too? Henson planted his cane and didn't move. Go ahead, but you're still going to have to answer for it when folks start asking questions. Only question I'm asking, came another voice, younger, rougher, is why the hell we're listening to a widow and a cripple defend a criminal. Eleanor recognized him, Tom Ridley, a ranch hand who spent more time at the saloon than the range, always looking for a fight. He pushed forward now, his face flushed with liquor courage and meanness. Boy's guilty, Ridley continued louder. Everyone knows it. Why else would he run? Why else would he hide here in her bakery? He sneered at Eleanor. Unless she's getting something out of the arrangement. The insinuation landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples of ugly laughter through the crowd. Eleanor's face burned, but she didn't look away, didn't flinch. Cal moved so fast she barely saw it. One moment he was beside her, the next he had Ridley by the collar, lifting him half off his feet, his voice cold and precise as a knife. Say that again. Ridley's bravado crumbled. I was just... Say it. Cal's knuckles were white. Give me a reason. Cal. Eleanor's hand touched his arm, gentle but firm. He's not worth it. For a heartbeat she thought he wouldn't listen, thought the rage simmering beneath his surface would boil over, would give Briggs exactly the excuse he needed. But then Cal's grip loosened, and he shoved Ridley back into the crowd, hard enough to send him stumbling. Next time you insult her, Cal said quietly, there won't be anyone to stop me. Briggs drew his pistol then, leveling it at Cal's chest. That's enough. You're under arrest for assault, threatening behavior, and suspicion of robbery. Put your hands up, now. Eleanor's heart stopped. She saw the way Cal's shoulders sagged, saw the resignation flood back into his eyes. He was going to surrender, going to let them take him, maybe to jail, maybe to a tree with a rope. Either way, she'd never see him again. She couldn't let that happen. Wait. Her voice cracked, but she forced it steady. Please. Just wait. Briggs didn't lower the gun. Ma'am, you're out of time. Give him 1 week. The words tumbled out before she could think them through. 1 week to prove his innocence. If he can't, he'll turn himself in. You have my word. Your word ain't worth much right now. Then take me as collateral. She lifted her chin, meeting his gaze straight on. Lock me up. If he runs, I'll serve his sentence. But if he's innocent, when he proves it, you let him go, and you apologize to this whole damn town for what you tried to do today. The crowd went silent. Even Briggs looked taken aback, his gun wavering slightly. Cal grabbed her arm. Eleanor, no. It's the only way, she said, not looking at him, keeping her eyes locked on the sheriff. 1 week. That's all we're asking. Briggs studied her, his expression unreadable. Then he looked at Cal, at the crowd, at old Henson still standing with his cane planted firm. The scales of judgment tipped in his mind, weighing reputation against certainty, spectacle against caution. Finally he holstered his gun. 3 days, he said. Not a week. 3 days to bring me proof, real proof, that he didn't ride with Jesse Kane. If you can't, he let the threat hang. Well, I hope you're as brave in a cell as you are in the street. Relief flooded through Eleanor so fast her knees went weak. 3 days. We'll take it. Briggs nodded curtly, then swung back onto his horse. Clock starts now. And Weston, if you so much as look at the town line, I'll shoot you myself. He rode off, his deputies trailing behind. The crowd dispersed slowly, reluctantly, their entertainment cut short but not forgotten. Eleanor could feel their eyes on her back, hear their whispers starting up again, sharper now, more vicious. She didn't care. The moment they were gone, Cal rounded on her, his face pale with anger and fear. What the hell were you thinking? I was thinking I wasn't going to watch you hang for something you didn't do. So you offered yourself instead. Eleanor, if I can't prove, then we'll figure it out together. She grabbed his shoulders, forcing him to look at her. 3 days, Cal. That's more than we had 10 minutes ago. We use them. He stared at her, and she watched the fear shift into something else. Determination, fierce and raw. Where do we even start? Silver Creek, where the robbery happened. She was already moving, pulling him back toward the bakery. Someone there must know something. A witness who saw Jesse's face. Someone who can confirm you weren't part of it. That's 2 days' ride from here. Then we better leave. Now. Inside the bakery, Eleanor moved with purpose, pulling down her traveling cloak, filling a satchel with bread and what little money she had left. Cal caught her wrist as she reached for the door. They'll talk, he said quietly. You ride out of town with me, alone. Your reputation. My reputation's already ruined. She met his eyes, unflinching. And I'd rather be ruined and right than respectable and complicit. Now are you coming, or do I ride to Silver Creek alone? A ghost of a smile touched his mouth. You're the stubbornest woman I've ever met. Good. You'll need that where we're going. They left through the back, avoiding the main street, cutting through the alleys and out past the edge of town where the prairie opened up vast and golden under the morning sun. Cal had a horse, a rangy bay he'd kept hidden in an abandoned barn, and Eleanor rode behind him, her arms wrapped around his waist, the wind pulling at her hair. The town shrank behind them, becoming a smudge on the horizon, then nothing at all. For a while they rode in silence, the rhythm of hoofbeats and breathing the only sound. Then Cal spoke, his voice nearly lost in the wind. Thank you. Eleanor tightened her grip. Don't thank me yet. We still have to find proof, even if we don't. He trailed off, then started again. No one's ever stood for me like that. Ever. She rested her forehead against his back, feeling the solid warmth of him, the rise and fall of his breathing. Then they were fools. They rode hard through the afternoon, stopping only to water the horse at a creek bed that cut silver through the grass. The sun climbed high, then began its slow descent, painting the prairie in shades of amber and rust. By the time darkness fell, they'd covered 20 miles, maybe more, and Eleanor's legs ached from gripping the horse. Cal found them shelter in a half-collapsed line shack, its roof mostly intact, its walls good enough to block the wind. He built a small fire while Eleanor laid out the bread she'd brought, and they ate in the flickering light, too exhausted for conversation. But later, when the fire had burned down to embers and the stars pressed close overhead, Cal spoke into the darkness. What made you believe me? Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, considering. I watched you fix my bakery, she said finally. Watched you take pride in learning to make bread rise right. A man who cares about doing things properly, who works that hard for someone else's dream. That's not a man who throws his lot in with thieves and killers. People change. Maybe I was different before. Maybe. But I know who you are now. And that's who I'm choosing to trust. Silence settled between them, warm despite the cold night air. Then Cal's hand found hers in the darkness, his fingers rough and calloused and steady. If this goes wrong, he said quietly, it won't. But if it does, I need you to know. He struggled with the words, then gave up trying to shape them perfectly. You gave me something I didn't think I'd ever have again. Hope. A reason to stop running. Whatever happens, that matters. You matter. Eleanor's throat tightened. She wanted to say something equally profound, equally true, but all that came out was, you matter too. His thumb traced across her knuckles, gentle and deliberate, and for a moment the weight of everything, the town, the threat, the impossible task ahead of them, lifted. For a moment there was just this, two people holding on to each other in the dark, refusing to let go. Get some sleep, Cal said eventually. Tomorrow's going to be hard. Eleanor nodded and curled up near the dying fire, her cloak wrapped tight around her shoulders. She heard Cal move to the doorway, taking first watch, his silhouette dark against the star-filled sky. She should have been afraid, should have been questioning every choice that had led her here, to a ruined shack in the middle of nowhere, chasing proof that might not exist, risking everything for a man she'd known less than a month. But as sleep pulled her under, all she felt was certainty. She'd made the right choice, and tomorrow they'd prove it. Outside, The prairie stretched endless and silent, the wind carrying the scent of sage and possibility. Somewhere ahead, in a town called Silver Creek, answers waited. All they had to do was reach them before time ran out. The second day broke gray and cold, the kind of morning that promised rain. They rode hard through it, pushing the bay as fast as they dared, stopping only when the horse needed rest. The landscape changed around them, rolling grassland giving way to rockier terrain, pine trees appearing in clusters that thickened into forest. By noon, Eleanor's whole body ached. She wasn't used to riding, and every jolt and bounce felt like punishment, but she didn't complain, just held tighter to Cal and kept her eyes on the horizon, where Silver Creek waited like a judgment they were riding toward instead of away from. They reached it as the sun touched the western mountains, turning the sky to fire. Silver Creek was bigger than Eleanor's town, busier, the kind of place where people came to find silver or trouble, usually both. The main street bustled with miners and merchants, saloons and supply stores, the air thick with smoke and noise and the promise of fortune or failure. Cal dismounted in front of a boarding house, helping Eleanor down. Her legs nearly buckled, but she caught herself, pride keeping her upright. "We need to find the sheriff here," Cal said, his voice low. "Ask about the robbery, about Jesse Kane. Someone must have seen something useful." Eleanor nodded, scanning the street. "And if they recognize you, then we run." He said it simply, matter of fact, like he'd done it before, probably had. They found the sheriff's office at the end of the street, a squat building with bars on the windows and a sign that had seen better days. Cal hesitated at the door, his hand hovering over the latch. "Could be a trap," he said quietly. "Walking in here could be our only chance." Eleanor pushed past him and opened the door herself. Inside, a man sat behind a desk cluttered with papers and coffee cups. He was younger than Briggs, leaner, with sharp eyes that took them in with a single glance. His badge caught the lamplight as he leaned back in his chair. "Help you folks?" Eleanor stepped forward before Cal could speak. "We're looking for information about a robbery. Stagecoach, about 3 weeks ago. Jesse Kane's gang." The sheriff's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Interest, or maybe suspicion. "You law?" "No, just looking for the truth. Truth's expensive around here." He shifted his gaze to Cal, studying him with the kind of attention that made Eleanor's pulse quicken. "You look familiar. I get that a lot." The sheriff smiled, thin and knowing. "I bet you do." He stood, moving around the desk with deliberate slowness. "Jesse Kane's a ghost. Robbed 4 stages in 2 months, killed 5 men, then vanished like smoke. You're not the first to come looking." "Did you catch anyone?" Eleanor asked. "Caught one. He's in a cell out back, waiting to hang." The sheriff's smile widened. "Maybe you'd like to talk to him. See if he knows anything useful." Hope flared in Eleanor's chest. "Yes, please." The sheriff led them through a narrow hallway to the cells. 3 of them, iron bars and stone walls, the air thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and despair. 2 cells were empty. The third held a man. He sat on a thin cot, his back against the wall, his face shadowed. But when he looked up, Eleanor saw the bruises, the split lip, the haunted look of someone who'd already seen the rope in his dreams. "Visitors," the sheriff said. "Make it quick." He left them there, his footsteps echoing back down the hall. Eleanor and Cal stepped closer to the bars. "What's your name?" Cal asked. The man laughed, bitter and broken. "What's it matter? I'll be dead in 2 days. It matters if you know Jesse Kane." That got his attention. His eyes sharpened, fixing on Cal. "Who's asking?" "Someone he tried to drag down with him." Recognition flickered across the prisoner's face. "Weston. Cal Weston. Jesse talked about you. Said you were too soft, too moral. Said you ran before the real work started." Eleanor's heart leapt. "Then you know he's telling the truth. You know Cal wasn't part of the robbery." The man shrugged. "Knowing and saying are different things. You're going to hang anyway," Cal said, his voice hard. "What difference does it make? Maybe I like company. Maybe I want someone else to swing beside me." Eleanor grabbed the bars. "Please, you tell the truth. You clear his name, and maybe there's mercy for you. A lighter sentence, something." The man studied her, and for a long moment she thought he'd refuse, thought bitterness and fear would win out over decency. But then his shoulders sagged, and he let out a long, shaky breath. "Jesse Kane rode with 3 of us that night. Me, Tom Harper, and Danny Cross. No one else. Weston wasn't there. He'd already left. Told Jesse to go to hell when he found out what we were planning. He met Cal's gaze. You were smarter than the rest of us. Got out before the blood. Relief crashed through Eleanor so hard she nearly collapsed. Will you testify to that? In front of Sheriff Briggs? In front of our town? Testify? The man laughed again, hollow. Lady, I'll be dead in 2 days. Ain't no testimony happening. Not if we get you a stay of execution, Cal said. Not if your testimony saves an innocent man. The prisoner looked at them both, something like hope flickering in his eyes, fragile, desperate. You really think you can do that? We can try, Eleanor said. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded. All right, I'll talk. But you better be fast. Clock's ticking for both of us. They left the cell and found the Silver Creek sheriff in his office. Eleanor told him everything. Cal's story, the prisoner's confession, the injustice waiting to happen back in their town. The sheriff listened, expression neutral, then leaned back in his chair. I'll write a statement, signed and witnessed. You take that back to your sheriff. Maybe it'll be enough. He paused. But if it's not, don't come crying to me. I did my part. Eleanor took the paper when he handed it over, her hands trembling. It was real. Proof. The truth, written down in black and white. They rode back through the night, not stopping, pushing the bay harder than they should have. Rain began to fall around midnight, cold and relentless, but Eleanor barely felt it. She clutched the statement inside her cloak, keeping it dry, keeping it safe. By the time dawn broke on the third day, they were back at the edge of town, exhausted and soaked and triumphant. Sheriff Briggs met them in the street, the same crowd gathered behind him, eager for the conclusion of their spectacle. He took the paper from Eleanor's hands, read it slowly, his expression darkening with every line. When he finished, he looked up at Cal, then at Eleanor. This true? Every word, Cal said. Briggs was quiet for a long moment. Then, slowly, he folded the paper and tucked it into his coat. Looks like I owe you an apology, Weston. The words hung in the air, and Eleanor felt the crowd shift. Surprise, disappointment, reluctant acceptance. You're free to go, Briggs said. No charges. Cal nodded once, his face unreadable. Then he turned and walked toward the bakery, Eleanor beside him, their hands finding each other in the space between. Behind them, the town whispered and stared. But ahead, the bakery door stood open, light spilling out onto the wet street. They stepped inside, together, and closed the door on the world outside. For now, they were safe. For now, the truth had won. And in the quiet that followed, Eleanor began to knead dough for tomorrow's bread, because life went on, and mercy, once given, had a way of echoing forward into all the days to come. The days after their return should have felt like victory. They didn't. Eleanor woke each morning to the same silence, heavy, watchful, the kind that pressed against the windows and seeped under the door. The town had been forced to accept Cal's innocence, forced to swallow the bitter truth that they'd been wrong, that their eagerness for judgment had nearly cost a man his life. But acceptance and forgiveness were different animals, and only one of them lived in this place. No one came to the bakery anymore. The first morning, Eleanor had baked anyway, filling the racks with bread that went unsold. The second morning, she halved her usual batch. By the third, she stood in the pre-dawn darkness staring at her depleted flour sack and trying to calculate how many more days she could afford to bake for ghosts. Cal worked beside her in silence, fixing things that didn't need fixing, organizing shelves that were already organized. He didn't say what they both knew, that his presence, his vindication, had only made things worse, that the town's shame had curdled into resentment, and resentment was punishing them both. On the fourth morning, Eleanor found a notice nailed to her door. Payment due, $340. Bank loan default, 30 days to settle or foreclosure proceedings. Begin. Her hands shook as she pulled it down. $340. It might as well have been $3,000. She'd been behind on payments since James died, scraping by on extensions and promises. But the bank had finally lost patience, or more likely, someone had reminded them that patience for a widow who defended criminals was bad for business. She crumpled the notice and shoved it in her apron pocket before Cal could see it. But he saw anyway, saw it in the way her shoulders hunched, in the way she moved through the morning's work with mechanical precision, her mind somewhere else, somewhere dark. What is it? He asked quietly, meeting her eyes across the work table. Nothing. Eleanor. She pulled the notice out and smoothed it on the counter between them. watched his face as he read it, watched the guilt settle over his features like ash. "This is because of me," he said. "This is because the bank wants its money. Money you don't have because no one's buying bread. Because of me." Eleanor slammed her palm on the counter hard enough to make him flinch. "Stop. I made my choices with my eyes open. Don't regret them, and I won't let you carry guilt that isn't yours. Then whose is it?" His voice rose, frustration and helplessness bleeding through. "The town's? They're not suffering. You are. You stood up for me, and now you're losing everything." "I already lost everything when James died." The words came out sharp, cutting, and she saw them land, saw Cal's expression crack. She softened, just slightly. "This bakery was dying long before you knocked on my door. You didn't kill it, you just reminded people that I'm still here, still stubborn enough to do what's right even when it costs." Cal stared at the notice, his jaw working. Then he turned and walked toward the back room. "Where are you going?" Eleanor called after him. "To fix this?" Cal, but he was already gone, the back door closing behind him with a finality that made her chest ache. She didn't see him for 2 days. Eleanor spent those days in a fog of anxiety and exhaustion. She baked smaller batches, sold almost nothing, watched her supplies dwindle. Mrs. Calloway came in once, buying a single roll with exact change and avoiding eye contact the entire time. Old Mr. Henson stopped by to sit on the bench outside, not buying anything, just sitting. A silent protest or an apology, Eleanor couldn't tell which. At night, she lay awake in the room above the shop, staring at the ceiling and wondering where Cal had gone. If he'd left for good this time. If she'd finally pushed him away with her stubbornness and her refusal to admit how bad things really were. The third morning, she woke to the sound of wagons. Eleanor dressed quickly and hurried downstairs, her heart pounding. Through the window, she saw them. 3 freight wagons parked in front of the bakery, their beds loaded with burlap sacks and wooden crates. Men were unloading them, carrying them toward her door. And for a wild moment she thought the bank had come early, that they were clearing her out ahead of schedule. Then she saw Cal. He stood beside the lead wagon, talking to the driver, his hat pushed back and his sleeves rolled up. When he saw her in the doorway, something flickered across his face. Relief, nervousness, hope. Eleanor stepped outside, her arms crossed against the morning chill. "What's all this?" "Delivery," Cal said simply. "I didn't order anything." "I know." He walked over, stopping just close enough that she could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the stubble darkening his jaw. He hadn't slept much either. "I did." One of the men carried a sack past her into the bakery. Flour, she realized. Good flour, the expensive kind she couldn't afford anymore. Another man followed with sugar, then salt, then yeast. Eleanor watched them work, her mind struggling to catch up. "Cal, I can't pay for this." "You don't have to." He pulled a folded paper from his pocket and handed it to her. "It's paid for." She unfolded it with trembling hands. It was a receipt for flour, sugar, salt, yeast, lard, and half a dozen other supplies she'd been rationing. Paid in full. The amount at the bottom made her dizzy. "Where did you get this kind of money?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Cal looked away, toward the horizon, his expression complicated. "Worked cattle drives for 3 years before I ended up here. Saved most of what I earned, didn't have much use for it, moving around like I did. Had it stashed in a bank up in Cheyenne." He met her eyes again. Rode up there, got it out, came back. Eleanor's throat tightened. "Cal, this is your money, your future." "My future's here." He said it simply, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. "If you'll have me," the words hung between them, weighted with more than he was saying, more than just business, more than just partnership. "You can't just..." She struggled for words, overwhelmed. "You can't throw away everything you've earned for..." "For what? For you?" He stepped closer, his voice dropping. "Eleanor, you gave me something I'd stopped believing existed. A place, a purpose, a reason to stop running." His hand lifted, hesitated, then gently touched her cheek. "You saved my life twice over. Once from that storm, and once from the man I was becoming. Empty, angry, alone. This money? It's nothing compared to that." Tears burned behind Eleanor's eyes. She wanted to argue, to push him away, to tell him he was a fool for tying his fortune to her sinking ship. But the truth was, she didn't want to lose him, didn't want to face the foreclosure and the emptiness alone. "The banknote," she said finally, her voice rough. It's $340. Cal nodded. I know. Stop by the bank first. Thing this morning. Eleanor's breath caught. What? He pulled another paper from his pocket. This one more official, sealed with the bank's stamp. Paid in full. Bakery's clear. The world tilted. Eleanor grabbed his arm to steady herself, the papers crumpling in her hand. You paid off my loan? Our loan now. His smile was small, uncertain. If you'll let me stay, let me be part of this. Part of... Cal, you just bought half a failing bakery. It's not failing anymore. He gestured to the wagons, to the supplies being unloaded. We've got enough here to last 6 months. Enough to rebuild, to wait out the town's coldness. And I've got more saved. Enough to make other investments. Eleanor stared at him, her mind reeling. What kind of investments? The kind that help people. His expression grew serious, determined. This town's hurting, Eleanor, not just us. I saw it while I was riding through. Empty storefronts, farms struggling, good people barely hanging on. The bank squeezing everyone, foreclosing on anyone who falls behind. So what are you saying? I'm saying we use what I've got to help. Buy up some of those debts, give people room to breathe. Maybe buy the storefronts. Keep them from turning into ghost buildings. Make this place worth living in again. Eleanor felt something crack open in her chest. Part disbelief, part hope so sharp it hurt. You want to save the whole town. I want to save the parts worth saving. He looked at her intently. Starting with this bakery. Starting with you. She didn't know she was crying until he reached up and wiped the tears from her cheek with his thumb, gentle and careful. Why? She whispered. Why would you do all this? Because someone once showed me that mercy matters. That standing up for what's right, even when it costs everything, is the only way to live with yourself. His voice dropped to something raw and honest. You taught me that. Let me prove I learned the lesson. Eleanor closed her eyes, overwhelmed by the weight of it. The gift, the trust, the promise of a future she'd stopped believing in. When she opened them again, Cal was watching her with an expression so vulnerable it made her heart ache. Partners? He asked quietly. She managed a shaky smile. Partners. He grinned then, real and bright, and pulled her into a hug that smelled like road dust and hope. Eleanor let herself lean into it, let herself believe, just for a moment, that maybe the worst was behind them. By afternoon, word had spread through town like wildfire. Cal Weston, the drifter, the accused criminal, the man they'd wanted to hang, had returned with enough money to buy up half the town's debt. The bank was suddenly flush with payments on overdue loans. The general store's mortgage, 2 months behind, was settled in full. The widow Henshaw, about to lose her boarding house, found her note paid off with a letter that simply said, paid in full, no repayment necessary. People started coming to the bakery again. Not all of them. Not the ones too proud or too bitter to admit they'd been wrong, but enough. Mr. Henson came first, buying 2 loaves and leaving an extra coin on the counter. Then Mrs. Calloway, shame-faced and quiet, ordering rolls for her guests. Then others, ranch hands, miners, families who'd been watching from the edges, waiting to see which way the wind would blow. By evening, Eleanor had sold out of bread for the first time in weeks. She stood at the counter, counting the coins with shaking hands, hardly believing it. Cal worked in the back, preparing dough for tomorrow's baking. His movements easy and familiar now, like he'd been doing this his whole life. People are talking, Eleanor said, glancing back at him. Let them talk. They're saying you're either a saint or a fool. Cal looked up, grinning. What do you think? She considered, then smiled. Both. He laughed, and the sound filled the bakery with warmth that had nothing to do with the stove. That night, after the shop was closed and the lamps turned low, they sat together by the fire, exhausted, flour-dusted, but lighter than they'd been in weeks. Eleanor mended her apron while Cal carved something from a piece of pine, the knife moving with practiced precision. What is that? She asked, nodding toward the wood. He held it up, a small loaf of bread, rendered in surprising detail. For you, to remember. Remember what? That night I knocked on your door. His voice went soft. The night you chose mercy over fear changed my whole life. Eleanor took the carving, running her fingers over the smooth wood, the careful grooves. You changed mine too. Their eyes met, and something passed between them. Understanding, gratitude, something deeper that neither had words for yet. The fire crackled. Outside, the town settled into night, its whispers fading into the darkness. You think they'll ever really forgive us? Eleanor asked. Cal was quiet for a moment. Some will, some won't. But I think most people just want to survive, same as us, and if we can help them do that. He shrugged. Maybe forgiveness will follow, or maybe it won't matter anymore. Eleanor nodded, turning the wooden loaf over in her hands. Thank you for staying, for all of this. Thank you for giving me a reason to. They sat in comfortable silence until the fire burned low and exhaustion pulled at their eyes. When Eleanor finally stood to head upstairs, Cal caught her hand. Eleanor, she turned, waiting. I meant what I said, about my future being here. He held her gaze steady and certain. I'm not leaving. Not ever. If I can help it. Her heart stuttered. She squeezed his hand, unable to speak past the emotion clogging her throat, and nodded. That was enough. For now, it was enough. The weeks that followed were strange and cautious and hopeful all at once. The town didn't transform overnight. Resentment still simmered in corners. Whispers still followed Eleanor and Cal down the street. But slowly, grudgingly, things began to shift. The storefronts Cal had bought reopened. A seamstress, a cobbler, a small bookshop. Jobs returned, money flowed. People who'd been one bad month from losing everything suddenly had room to breathe. And they remembered who'd given them that room. The bakery thrived. Eleanor hired help, a young woman named Sarah whose family farm Cal had saved from foreclosure. Together, they baked enough bread to feed the town twice over, and people bought it. Not out of pity anymore, but because it was good, because it was made with care. Cal split his time between the bakery and his other investments, always working, always building. But every evening, he came back to the shop, rolled up his sleeves, and helped clean up. And every evening, Eleanor found herself watching him, the way he moved, the way he smiled at small victories, the way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't paying attention. One evening, as spring crept closer and the air turned soft with promise, Cal set down the pan he'd been scrubbing and turned to face her. Eleanor. She looked up from the dough she was shaping. I've been thinking, dangerous habit. He smiled, but there was nervousness behind it. This partnership, it's working. Better than I ever hoped. It is. And I was wondering. He wiped his hands on a rag, suddenly uncertain in a way she rarely saw. If maybe you'd consider making it permanent, legal, official. Eleanor's hands stilled in the dough. Official how? Cal crossed to her, stopping close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. Marry me. The words dropped like stones into still water, sending ripples through everything. Eleanor's breath caught. Cal, I know it's fast. I know people will talk. But I also know I don't want to spend another day pretending this is just business. That you're just my partner. His hand came up, cupping her cheek, flour dust and all. You're everything, Eleanor. The reason I stopped running. The reason I started building. I want to spend the rest of my life proving I'm worth the mercy you showed me that night. Tears blurred her vision. You already have. So is that a yes? She laughed, broken and bright, and kissed him, flour-dusted and exhausted and more certain than she'd been of anything in years. Yes, she whispered against his mouth. Yes. Cal pulled her close, holding her like she was something precious he'd thought he'd lost. And Eleanor let herself believe in futures again, in second chances, in the kind of love that grew not from grand gestures, but from quiet mornings and shared work and choosing each other over and over, in the face of a world that said they shouldn't. Outside, the first stars appeared. Inside, the bakery glowed warm and golden. And somewhere beyond the window, the town that had tried to break them began, slowly, to heal. Spring came to the prairie like a promise finally kept. The snow that had lingered in the shadows melted away, leaving the earth dark and rich and ready. Wildflowers pushed through the grass, Indian paintbrush and prairie clover, splashes of color against the endless green. The air turned soft, carrying the scent of rain and new growth, and the cottonwoods along the creek unfurled their leaves like hands opening to receive a blessing. Eleanor stood at the bakery window in the early morning light, watching the town wake up. It looked different now, not just in the physical sense, though that was true too. The storefronts Cal had bought and reopened were thriving. The boarding house had fresh paint. The church had a new bell that rang clear and bright on Sunday mornings. But the real difference was harder to name. It was in the way people moved through the streets, less hunched, less hurried. In the way they greeted each other. In the laughter that drifted from the saloon and the schoolyard. Hope had a sound, Eleanor realized. and this town was finally learning to sing it again. Behind her, she heard Cal moving through the back room, the familiar rhythm of his morning routine. Water from the pump, the scrape of a chair, the soft thud of his boots on the wooden floor. 3 months married, and already his presence had woven itself so completely into her life that she couldn't remember what silence had sounded like before him. He appeared in the doorway, shirt half-buttoned, hair still damp from washing, and smiled when he saw her at the window. "You're up early," he said, crossing to stand behind her, his arms wrapping around her waist. Eleanor leaned back against his chest, solid and warm. "Couldn't sleep. Bad dreams? Good ones, actually." She turned in his arms to face him. "That's what kept me awake. Kept thinking I'd wake up and find out it was all just wishful thinking." Cal's expression softened. He cupped her face in his hands, thumbs brushing her cheekbones. "It's real. All of it. I promise." She believed him, but belief was a fragile thing, still healing from years of disappointment, and sometimes she needed to hear it spoken aloud. "Come on," Cal said, taking her hand. "Let's get the oven started. Bread waits for no one." They worked side by side as the sun climbed higher, kneading dough and shaping loaves with the easy coordination of two people who'd learned each other's rhythms. Sarah arrived just after dawn, bringing with her a basket of eggs from her family's farm and news that her younger brother had been accepted to the teacher's college in Cheyenne. "It's because of you," she said, looking at Cal with gratitude that still seemed to catch him off guard. "The loan you gave my father. We'd never have been able to afford the tuition otherwise." Cal shook his head, uncomfortable with the praise. "Your brother earned it, just helped clear the path a little. You cleared more than a path." Sarah's voice grew firm. "You gave a lot of families in this town their futures back. Don't think we've forgotten." After she disappeared into the back to start on the morning's pastries, Eleanor caught Cal's eye and smiled. "You're a hero whether you like it or not." "I'm a man who got lucky," he corrected. "Found the right woman at the right time. Everything else just followed, romantic and humble." "No wonder I married you." He grinned and kissed her forehead before returning to his work. The morning rush started just after 7. It was a steady stream now, miners stopping for bread and coffee before their shifts, ranch hands buying supplies for the week, families with children who pressed their noses against the glass case and pointed at the cinnamon rolls Sarah had become famous for. Mrs. Calloway came in, as she did every morning, and actually smiled at Eleanor. "Lovely day," she said, counting out coins for her usual order. "It is," Eleanor agreed. "I heard the Hendersons are opening a restaurant next month, using that empty building on 4th Street that Mr. Weston bought." "That's right. Good people. Town could use more places to gather." Mrs. Calloway nodded, then hesitated, her expression shifting to something more vulnerable. "I wanted to say, I'm sorry for how I was, how we all were, when Mr. Weston first came here." Eleanor's hands stilled on the bread she'd been wrapping. This was the first time anyone had actually apologized, not through actions or silent gestures, but with words. "We were scared," Mrs. Calloway continued, her voice dropping. "And scared people do cruel things, but that's no excuse. You stood up for what was right when the rest of us were ready to hang an innocent man. That took courage, real courage." She met Eleanor's eyes. "Thank you for being braver than we were." Eleanor's throat tightened. "Thank you for saying that." Mrs. Calloway took her rolls and left, and Eleanor stood there for a moment, feeling something inside her chest shift and settle. Forgiveness. Not earned through grand gestures, but through time and honesty in the slow work of rebuilding trust. Cal appeared at her elbow. "You all right?" She nodded, wiping at her eyes. "Yeah, better than all right." By afternoon, the spring warmth had coaxed half the town outdoors. Children ran through the streets, their laughter high and bright. Old Mr. Henson sat on his usual bench, whittling and watching the world go by with something approaching contentment. Even Tom Ridley, who'd once called Cal a criminal in the middle of the street, tipped his hat as he passed the bakery, looking sheepish. Eleanor took advantage of the lull to slip outside, breathing in the sweet air and letting the sun warm her face. Cal found her there a moment later, leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed and a look of satisfaction on his face. "Remember when this street was empty?" he asked. "Hard to forget. And now look at it." He gestured at the bustling scene. Life, real life. People building futures instead of just surviving. Eleanor reached for his hand, lacing their fingers together. "You did that. We did that." He squeezed her hand. You were doing it long before I showed up, feeding people who couldn't pay, keeping this place open when every reason said to quit. All I did was give you the tools to keep going. Tools and a reason. He looked at her, curiosity in his eyes. What reason? To believe that good things could still happen. That I wasn't meant to spend the rest of my life alone, just surviving. She turned to face him fully. You gave me hope, Cal. Real hope. The kind that makes you want to wake up in the morning. His expression cracked open, vulnerable and raw. Eleanor, whatever he was going to say was interrupted by the sound of a wagon rolling up, its wheels creaking under a heavy load. They both turned to see a freight wagon stopping in front of the bakery, and Eleanor's heart gave a little leap of surprise. The driver climbed down, tipping his hat. Delivery for Brooks. I didn't order anything, Eleanor said, confused. The man consulted his paperwork. Says here it's paid for, sender's anonymous. He gestured to the back of the wagon. Special order. Said to deliver it today specifically. Cal moved to help unload, and Eleanor watched in bewilderment as they carried in crate after crate. When the last one was inside and the driver had departed, Cal pried open the first crate with a crowbar. Eleanor gasped. Inside, packed in straw, was a brand new cast iron oven, the kind she'd seen in catalogs but never dreamed of affording, the kind that baked evenly and held heat perfectly and would let her expand production tenfold. Cal, she breathed. Did you? Not me. He looked genuinely surprised, pulling out a note tucked inside the crate. His expression shifted as he read it, something warm and complicated crossing his face. He handed it to Eleanor. The handwriting was shaky but legible. For the woman who fed us when we were hungry, and the man who saved us when we were drowning. May your hearth never grow cold, and your kindness never be forgotten. The families of Silver Creek Township. Eleanor's vision blurred with tears. She looked at the other crates. One held professional baking pans, another a set of measuring tools, a third was filled with recipe books and supplies she'd never even heard of. All of it gifts, all of it gratitude made tangible. They remembered, she whispered. Cal pulled her close, his chin resting on top of her head. Of course they remembered. Good doesn't disappear just because time passes. It echoes. They spent the rest of the afternoon unpacking and marveling, and by evening the bakery looked more like a professional operation than a struggling widow's shop. Eleanor ran her hands over the new oven, already imagining what she could create with it, not just bread, but cakes and pastries and things she'd never had the equipment to attempt before. We could expand, she said, the idea forming as she spoke. Hire more help, maybe even open a second location eventually. Cal leaned against the counter, watching her with undisguised affection. Whatever you want, sky's the limit now. What I want, Eleanor said, turning to face him, is to build something that lasts. Something that helps people the way we were helped. A place where everyone's welcome, no matter how much money they have or what mistakes they've made. A place like this one. Exactly like this one, just bigger. He crossed to her and took both her hands. Then that's what we'll build. Together. Eleanor smiled, and in that moment, standing in the bakery that had been her prison and her salvation, surrounded by evidence of kindness returned and lives rebuilt, she felt something she hadn't felt since James died. Complete. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the prairie in shades of gold and amber, Cal suggested they take a walk. Eleanor agreed, and they left Sarah to close up the shop, heading toward the edge of town where the grasslands began. They walked in comfortable silence, their hands swinging between them, until they reached a small rise that overlooked the valley. Below, the town spread out like a patchwork quilt. Lights beginning to glow in windows, smoke curling from chimneys, the distant sound of the church bell marking the hour. I used to hate this view, Eleanor said quietly. Used to stand here and feel trapped, like the world was too small and I was suffocating in it. And now? She considered, watching the way the light caught on the buildings, on the trees lining the creek. Now it feels like home, like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. Cal slipped his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close against the evening chill. You know what I see when I look at this town? What? Second chances. His voice was soft, reverent. Every person down there, they're not perfect. Made mistakes, hurt people, failed in 100 different ways, but they're still here, still trying, still believing that tomorrow might be better than today. He looked down at her. That's what you taught me. that it's never too late to become who you're meant to be. Eleanor's chest tightened with emotion. And who are you meant to be? Your husband, your partner, the man who gets to wake up every morning and watch you turn flour and water into something that feeds people's bodies and souls. He smiled. Turns out that's exactly who I needed to be all along. Just took a storm and a stubborn widow to show me. She laughed, thick with tears. I'm not that stubborn. You're the stubbornest woman I've ever met. It's one of your best qualities. They stood there as the sun sank lower, turning the sky to fire, and Eleanor thought about the journey that had brought them here. The fear and the mercy and the choice to stand for truth even when it cost everything. The long ride to Silver Creek with hope as their only compass. The slow, painful work of rebuilding trust. And finally, this, peace earned through persistence, love grown from shared hardship. Cal, she said softly, thank you. For knocking on my door that night, for giving me a reason to remember who I was. He pressed a kiss to her temple. Thank you for opening it. For choosing mercy over fear. Changed both our lives. Below them, the town settled into evening. Lamps glowed warmer as the darkness deepened. Somewhere a fiddle started playing, and laughter drifted on the wind. Life continuing, healing, growing stronger in the broken places. They walked back as the stars emerged, pinpricks of light in an endless sky. The bakery waited for them, warm and welcoming, and Eleanor felt gratitude swell in her chest, not just for Cal, but for every hard moment that had led to this one, every choice that had felt impossible but proved necessary, every act of faith that had seemed foolish until it bloomed into something beautiful. Inside, Sarah had left a note on the counter. Everything's ready for tomorrow. See you at dawn. Sss. Eleanor smiled and tucked the note into her apron pocket. Tomorrow would come, as it always did, and with it new challenges and new opportunities. But tonight, she had this, the man she loved, the home they'd built together, and the quiet certainty that some endings were really just beginnings in disguise. Cal banked the fire in the stove while Eleanor locked the door. They climbed the stairs to their room, exhausted and content, and fell asleep in each other's arms as the prairie wind whispered against the windows. Weeks turned to months, and the rhythm of their lives settled into something sustainable and good. The bakery expanded. They hired 3 more workers, young people from struggling families, giving them wages and purpose and the dignity of honest work. Eleanor taught them her craft with patience, the same way Cal had taught her that persistence mattered more than perfection. The second location opened in late summer, in a building Cal had purchased on the far side of town. It specialized in wedding cakes and fancy pastries, things Eleanor had always wanted to make but never had the resources for. It thrived from day one, and soon people were coming from neighboring towns just to taste what the Brooks Bakery had to offer. Cal's other investments flourished too. The restaurant opened. The bookshop became a gathering place for the town's readers and dreamers. The boarding house expanded to accommodate travelers and new settlers. Drawn by word that Silver Creek Township was a place where good people helped each other survive and thrive. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the town's character changed. The hardness that had defined it, the suspicion, the quick judgment, the willingness to condemn before understanding, began to soften. Not because Cal and Eleanor preached or demanded it, but because they lived differently, chose mercy when vengeance was easier, offered help when profit made more sense, stood up for truth even when lies were more convenient. People noticed. People learned. One autumn afternoon, as Eleanor was preparing for the evening rush, Sheriff Briggs walked into the bakery. She tensed instinctively, old memories rising, but his expression was neutral, almost friendly. Mrs. Weston, he said, nodding respectfully. Got a moment? Eleanor wiped her hands on her apron. Of course, Sheriff, what can I do for you? He shifted his weight, looking uncomfortable. I wanted to apologize, properly, for how I handled things with your husband. I was. He paused, searching for words. I was more interested in being right than being just. Nearly cost a good man his life. Eleanor studied him, this man who'd once held a gun on Cal, who'd been ready to hang him on circumstantial evidence. She saw genuine regret in his eyes now, the kind that came from soul-searching and growth. Thank you for saying that, Sheriff. I've been watching, you both. What you've done for this town. The way you treat people, even people like me, who don't deserve it. He met her gaze. You're teaching us something important, about what a community should be. Thought you should know it's working. After he left, Eleanor stood at the counter for a long moment, her hands trembling slightly. Cal appeared from the back, having heard the conversation, and wrapped his arms around her from behind. "You all right?" he murmured against her hair. She nodded, leaning into him. "Yeah, just. Reminded that grace is contagious. You offer it to one person, and it spreads. Like ripples in water." "Or like bread rising," Cal said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. "Give it time and warmth, and it becomes more than you ever imagined." Eleanor turned in his arms, looking up at him. "I love you. You know that?" His expression softened. "I know. Love you too, more than I thought I was capable of loving anything." They kissed, gentle and familiar, and when they pulled apart, the bakery felt like exactly what it was. A sanctuary built on second chances and the stubborn belief that people were worth fighting for. Winter came again, as it always did, bringing snow and cold and long nights. But this time, the bakery stayed warm and full. This time, no one went hungry. This time, when storms rolled across the prairie, people knew they had shelter, not just from the weather, but from the hardness of a world that sometimes forgot how to be kind. On Christmas Eve, Eleanor and Cal opened the bakery doors and invited the whole town in for a celebration. They served bread and cakes and hot cider, and people came, not just customers, but friends. Families crowded around tables. Children played on the floor. Old Mr. Henson told stories that made everyone laugh. Mrs. Calloway sang carols in a voice surprisingly sweet. As Eleanor moved through the crowd, refilling cups and greeting neighbors, she caught sight of Cal across the room. He was crouched down, talking to a little girl who'd spilled her cider, helping her clean it up with such gentleness that the child's tears turned to giggles. And Eleanor thought about that night, the storm, the knock at her door, the choice between fear and mercy, thought about how one decision, made in a moment of exhaustion and uncertainty, had changed everything. Not just for her and Cal, but for all these people, for the whole town. Mercy had echoed forward, touching lives they'd never even met, creating futures they'd never imagined. Later, after everyone had gone home and the bakery was clean, Eleanor and Cal stood at the window watching snow fall soft and silent over the sleeping town. "Think we'll still be doing this in 20 years? Cal asked, his arm around her waist. Eleanor smiled. "Doing what? Baking bread?" "Choosing to believe the best in people, even when it's hard." She thought about it, then nodded. "Yeah, I think we will, because that's who we are now. Who we become together. Good." He pulled her closer. "Because I'm not done yet. Got at least 50 more years of mercy to spread." Eleanor laughed, the sound warm and genuine, and leaned her head against his shoulder. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the world in white, covering the scars and the mistakes and the ugly parts, at least for a little while, reminding everyone that renewal was always possible. That spring always followed winter, no matter how long the cold lasted. Inside the bakery, the embers in the stove glowed soft and red, holding warmth against the night. On the counter sat the wooden loaf Cal had carved months ago, now worn smooth from Eleanor's fingers tracing its curves. A reminder, a promise. And beyond the window, dawn was already waiting, golden and inevitable, ready to pour light over the prairie and the town and the two people who'd learned that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is open the door when someone knocks, even in the middle of a storm, especially then, because you never know who's standing on the other side, waiting for the mercy that might save both your lives.